Hi, I'm Dan, and welcome to Polar Currency and video number 9. To be blunt, this video basically explores the reason that you have to be dead to be on US currency, which may or may not include coins. For some reason, there seems to be some rule bending or no rules at all when it comes to US coinage. I'll get to that later. So, who meets the criteria of the US Treasury Department to be the face of our currency? Well, they have to be historically important, popular, very recognizable by the public, and of course, they're dead.
From the beginning, the founders of our nation felt it was improper to honor any living person by putting their image on legal tender, especially coins, which is all the federal government would issue until 1861. The founders, being anti-royalists, of course, didn't want to reflect any monarchy whose kings and queens made it their favorite things to just put their face on money. And right off the bat, we find some irony that in 1893, Queen Isabella of Spain was placed on the 1893 commemorative quarter, by the way, making her the first named woman to appear on a U.S. coinage. Adding to this was Christopher Columbus being placed on the 1893 commemorative half dollar. Why is this strange and ironic? Because these were the first two named individuals to ever appear on U.S. coinage, and neither one of them was from the United States, and one of them was a monarch. Quick constitutional sidebar here. There are some assumptions that the framers of the U.S. Constitution intended to prohibit the federal government from issuing paper currency as legal tender. Yet the language of Article 1, Section 10 fails to carry out the intent clearly in 1788. 9 years later, in a letter dated November 26, 1798, Thomas Jefferson lamented the weak language of the Constitution, writing to a friend, "I wish it were possible to obtain a single amendment to our Constitution. I now would deny their power of making money or anything else legal tender." The issue of if the U.S. government could produce paper currency as legal tender was finally settled by the Supreme Court in 1884. And it's kind of funny that Jefferson has been honored by being on various types of paper currency since the 1850s. So in the early 1790s, at the beginning of the U.S. Mint, the female allegorical figure Liberty was adopted for the obverse with an eagle on the reverse for most coins over the next 125 years. It's said that George Washington declined the honor to have his portrait on the first U.S. dollar coin. A bit ironic that he is now on both the $1 bill and the U.S. quarter.
Washington or not, a long tradition of liberty and eagles started, but keep in mind there wasn't actual legislation preventing a living person's likeness from appearing on any currency. Yet. But again, this was for coins. In 1790, paper money wasn't happening, and when it was issued 70 years later, it took a very different and controversial path of who could be, or rather who should be, on the face of currency.
The story starts in 1861 with the onset of the U.S. Civil War. Early on, it became very apparent for both the Union and Confederate governments that they did not have the funds, specifically in hard gold and silver, to wage war. With uncertainty of the Union dissolving and the war, citizens began hoarding all precious metals and coins. There was also very little gold and silver coming into the U.S. Treasury. Both sides had to be creative, and they both began issuing forms of paper currency. The Confederacy acted first, issuing interest-bearing notes in March of 1861, less than a month before the first armed engagement at Fort Sumter. A few months later, the Union passed the Congressional Acts of July 17 and August 5, 1861, allowing the issuance of demand notes, only in much smaller denominations than the Confederacy. The first Confederate notes were printed in New York by the National Banknote Company and smuggled across Union lines. Ironically, the National Banknote Company was about to win the contract to print all U.S. postage stamps. I guess the saying is true, all is fair in love and war, and making stamps. With all the hoarding of coins, hard change was difficult to come by, and the U.S. Mint could not keep up. An idea from the Treasury Department was to use postage stamps as currency, which was by no means perfect, but it was a short-term solution. This led to additional legislation to issue specific postage currency in 1862 and 1863, which led to fractional paper currency issued from 1863 to 1876 for transactions less than $1. Accounting for inflation, an 1862 dollar is equal to $35 today, and an average annual wage was $750 a year. Change mattered, and that's what brings us full circle as to why you have to be dead to appear on U.S. currency.
There is little information as to the selection process of who or what appears on U.S. paper currency, other than ultimately it is the decision of the Secretary of the Treasury. Congress has the ability to enact legislation, but that has only been used for the purpose of coinage. With all the new money being created, it doesn't appear there was any debate at the time as to who or what or who should be portrayed on currency, dead or alive.
Being dead sidebar, there is a law that states no living person can be portrayed on U.S. currency or any other obligation of the United States. More on that later. What has created some confusion is you have to be dead for 2 years. Well, that's not entirely true. Public Law 109-145, the Presidential $1 Coin Act of 2005, states to be on any of the presidential coins, you have to be dead for 2 years. But that's only for the $1 and related presidential coins. It doesn't apply to any other currency. That's why President George H.W. Bush, number 41, his dollar wasn't released until 2020, 2 years after he passed in 2018. But that wasn't true when the U.S. government began issuing paper currency in 1861. End of sidebar. By 1862, with the war raging, it was clear that the Union was in desperate need for more money, a lot more money. And the Confederacy was in the same boat, albeit theirs was already sinking. They just didn't know it yet. Anyway, both sides were on the brink of bankruptcy. For the United States, or the Union, that led to demand notes issued in 1861. Then came congressional legislation creating United States notes, i.e. legal tender notes in 1862, and national banknotes in 1863.
And then there was fractional notes. According to Paper Money of the United States 22nd edition by our friends Arthur and Ira Friedberg, during the early years of the Civil War, banks suspended specie, gold and silver payments, putting a premium on all coins. Coins of all denominations were hoarded and all but disappeared from circulation. The result made it impossible for merchants to give small change. Fractional currency lasted for 14 years, and by 1876, when Congress called for the redemption of the notes, almost $396 million of fractional currency was turned in for silver.
Things were going fine and paper currency was just flying off the presses. No one seemed to care whose portraits were on the banknotes, at least not until the third issue of fractional currency started being printed in 1866, when someone got a bee in their bonnet. The first few years of paper currency production had 3 living men appear on currency with no reported objections or concerns from anyone. President Abraham Lincoln became the first living person to have their likeness appear on any type of U.S. currency, paper or coin. He was on the 1861 $10 demand note, the 1861 $100 federal bond, and the 1862 $10 legal tender note. Salmon P. Chase, the U.S. Secretary of the Treasury at the time, appeared on the 1861 $1,000 interest-bearing note and the 1862 $1 legal tender note. And by 1866, General Winfield Scott, old Fuss and Feathers himself, had appeared on the 1861 $500 interest-bearing note and the $100 interest-bearing note issued in 1864, all with no complaints from anyone. But that all stopped in 1866. Late 1865 was the year when Chief Clerk of the National Currency Division of the U.S. Treasury, Spencer M. Clark, made the poor decision to place his own portrait on the new 5-cent fractional currency note that created quite the controversy. The story goes that the bill was supposed to have William Clark, as in Lewis and Clark, on the note, but only the name Clark was submitted, so Spencer Clark saw the opening and took it, claiming some bureaucratic ignorance, and placed his own face on the fractional note. My 5-cent fractional note has the chief clerk of the National Currency Division, Spencer Clark, right front and center. The front is only printed in black ink. In the lower left corner is an illustration of typical trade goods at the time, but I can't make out the writing on that crate, and I want to, but I found no information as to what it actually says. Behind the goods is a caduceus, a symbol for medicine. Why is that there? I just don't get it. Were those being sold left and right as trade goods right along with the barrel of liquor or whatever it is? In the right corner has an illustration of a scythe, which is a big sickle and a hammer. A little bit Karl Marx for me, but the detail is unbelievably incredible for this amount of design on such a small note. The reverse, printed in green, has more of a currency design feel than the front. It bears the denomination, though not listing cents, and the legal obligation. The size of the note is approximately 2.5 inches by 1.8 inches, quite small compared against a large-size note of the time. As I stated, the controversy wouldn't come to a head until 1866. At the time, Spencer Clark took the full brunt of the controversy, even though his two superiors, Secretary of the Treasury William P. Fessenden and U.S. Treasury Francis E. Spinner, who were legally bound and responsible to approve the decision, were also placed on the 25 and 50-cent notes for the third issue of the fractional currency. Let's be clear here. Fessenden and Spinner rubber-stamped their own likeness on fractional currency, and they were Clark's superiors. So who was in the wrong? The 25-cent fractional note bears the portrait of 26th Secretary of the Treasury William P. Fessenden. Along the bottom are the signatures of the Register of the Treasury and the U.S. Treasurer, along with the typical verbiage of currency. On each side of the note is a green overlay design with 25 in the center that's barely visible on my note. This was actually a bronze powder that was applied with glue and used for anti-counterfeiting. It originally appeared as a gold tone but oxidized to green over time, as does brass and copper. It didn't work out very well because it was really messy. The reverse is printed in the standard currency green ink with the legal obligation and the value with cents included. It also has that green bronze powder 25 overlay print. The note measures roughly 3 3/4 inches wide by 1.8 inches high. Fessenden replaced Salmon P. Chase, who was appointed Chief Justice of the Supreme Court by Lincoln. After Fessenden resigned as Secretary of the Treasury, he returned to the U.S. Senate representing the state of Maine. Spencer M. Clark survived the controversy and served as the first head of the infant agency that eventually became the Bureau of Engraving and Printing until 1868.
The person with a bee in their bonnet? A Republican congressman from Pennsylvania, Representative Martin R. Thayer. Thayer became a very outspoken critic, accusing that the Treasury's privilege of portrait selection for currency was being abused. In 1866, Thayer delivered a fiery speech to Congress stating, "I hold in my hand a 5-cent note of this fractional currency of the United States. If you ask me, whose image and superscription is this? I am obliged to answer, not that of George Washington, which used to adorn it, but the likeness of a person who superintends the printing of these notes. I would like any man to tell me why his face should be on the money of the United States." That's what Thayer said.
The 39th Congress agreed and enacted the Legislative Act of April 7, 1866, Article 45, Chapter 28, Section 12, stating that no portrait or likeness of any living person hereafter engraved shall be placed upon any of the bonds, securities, notes, fractional or postal currency of the United States. At the time, Spencer Clark took all the heat. Over time, he kind of has been forgotten and the blame shifted to Francis E. Spinner, and Mr. Fessenden literally got off scot-free. The bill passed and became law, but it only applied to currency, not coins. The most infamous of the three controversial notes is called the Spinner note. The 50-cent note has the smiling portrait of Francis E. Spinner on the front. The signatures are located in each corner. The ornate 50 design on the left and right is repeated with the green overprint. The reverse is printed in standard green and has the faded bronze to green 50 overlay in the center. The dimensions of the 50-cent fractional measure about 4.5 inches wide by 1.8 inches high. Francis E. Spinner has become famous amongst currency collectors for his unique signature that was engraved on all greenbacks for 13 years from 1861 to 1875. It's said he developed the flamboyant signature, written with a calligraphy pen, as a counterfeiting prevention tool. Spinner was a politician from New York serving in the House before being appointed by Lincoln. Fessenden served as the Secretary of Treasury for less than a year, but it's said he brought much-needed stability to a potential financial crisis in 1864 before he went back to the Senate. But he wasn't completely forgotten. He did make it on a tobacco stamp in 1902. Talk about random. All three of these fractional notes have the signatures of Register of the Treasury, Stoddard B. Colby, who was a lawyer from Vermont appointed by Lincoln in 1864, and who died in office in 1867 at the age of 52. The U.S. Treasurer's signature is none other than Francis E. Spinner. Yes, his signature is on the same note that bears his own portrait. And thanks to Congressman Thayer, the one and only time that this ever happened. Spinner was a politician from New York, a major general in the New York State Militia, and served for 3 terms in the House before being appointed by Lincoln. He survived the scandal, serving as U.S. Treasurer until 1875 and passed away in 1890 at the age of 88. The reverse of all 3 of the controversial fractional notes were also printed with green and red ink, and the 50-cent Spinner note also had 2 different reverse designs. All of these notes have multiple varieties, with the Spinner note being assigned 51 different Friedberg numbers alone. But Spencer Clark's story doesn't end with his face on currency. He does have another footnote in history that's worth conversation. Clark gave testimony as an ink expert at President Lincoln's assassination trial. He was called to testify regarding a pair of boots that were confiscated from accused conspirator Lewis Powell. Clark was given one of the boots to inspect an ink marking on the interior lining. After performing various tests, he was able to remove the top layer of ink and was able to reveal the letters J, W, but could not conclude if the third letter was a P or a B. 2 more letters could be seen at the end of the marking, T and H. He concluded that the overlaying ink mark was placed there to hide writing that lay beneath. Spencer Clark's testimony at the trial was brief but effective to prove that the boots worn by Powell had either been owned or purchased by John Wilkes Booth, and helped the prosecution send the convicted to the gallows and their deaths.
Was it the end of only living people on U.S. currency? For paper, the answer is a hard yes. But the rules have been bent a few times with coinage, if there are any rules at all, especially with the original commemorative coins minted from 1892 to 1954.
There have been 5 living people who have appeared on a U.S. coin, beginning with Alabama Governor Thomas E. Kilby. He was the first living person to ever appear on a U.S. coin and is depicted on the 1921 Alabama Centennial half dollar. President Calvin Coolidge appears on the obverse alongside George Washington on the sesquicentennial of American Independence half dollar, you say it, that's not that easy, released in 1926 to commemorate the 150th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. I gotta say this again. The Lynchburg, Virginia sesquicentennial half dollar of 1936 has the obverse portrait of Senator Carter Glass, and Arkansas Senator Joseph T. Robinson's portrait is on the reverse of the 1936 Arkansas centennial half dollar. The last living person who ever appeared on a U.S. coin was Eunice Kennedy Shriver, the sister of President John F. Kennedy, and at the time one of the very few named women to ever appear on any type of U.S. currency. Her portrait is on the 1995 commemorative $1 coin issued in honor of the Special Olympic World Games. Shriver was one of the co-founders of the Special Olympics. On a related side note, First Lady Nancy Reagan appeared on the 2016 $10 First Spouse gold coin released in July of 2016. Well, Mrs. Reagan had only just passed on March 6, 2016. She hadn't been dead for 2 years for the presidential coin thing, and special legislation was passed to waive the 2-year rule. The question is, why did President George H.W. Bush's presidential dollar have to wait for 2 years? As always, you have to love bureaucracy.
The face of our currency has portrayed almost 50 named individuals. I find it perplexing that most coins get an act of Congress to receive a new design. Not portraits, that's a different rule or no rule at all, which one would assume when you hear the old saying, you need an act of Congress, that would be difficult. But if it's a coin, no. Congress passes that as easy as a tax increase or a salary increase for themselves. A recent example is Public Law number 116330, the Circulating Coin Collectible Coin Redesign Act of 2020. Coins have already been issued and will continue through 2030. But currency only needs one person to pull the trigger for a change, the Secretary of the Treasury. And nothing happens. Ever. And that is the face of currency. If you like what you see, please hit the thumbs up button and feel free to leave a comment. And we'll see you in 2 weeks. And again, thanks for checking in.